Thank you for joining this talk, which is part of the Heritage at Risk lecture series. I'm Desola Adeyemi. I'm currently on the International Advisory Committee for the CHF, and I'll be chairing the talk today. This talk is being recorded, and it will be available on the Commonwealth Heritage Forum website at a later date. Today's talk will take approximately 40 to 45 minutes, with some time for discussions and questions at the end. So please share any questions you have in the chat box at the end. I'll get on with it. So today I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, who's Peregrine Bryant. Peregrine is an eminent conservation architect with significant projects based in the UK. He was a Crown Estate approved architect and on the approved list for the London Diocesan Council, and has worked on Royal Hospital, Belmont Lyme Regis, and Bodiam Castle. He's also a trustee of the CHF and the St. Helena UK Heritage Trust, and the chairman of the Jamaican Heritage Renewal. Peregrine also happens to be the brave soul who introduced me to conservation architecture many years ago, so I'm very grateful. So today's talk will look at the abandoned heritage buildings on St. Helena, including some that have been rescued. We'll start with a brief introduction to the geography and history of St. Helena, and Peregrine will take us through a couple of buildings in Jamestown, the capital, one or two in the country, and a few selected military forts, ending on some hopeful repurposing plans for the future. So over to you, Peregrine. Go forth and educate us.
Thank you, Desola, very much indeed. And it's my pleasure to welcome everybody who's joined us. And it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm in deepest Wales, but I hope the signal is going to be adequate for our purposes. I should first say perhaps that I'm pretty much a Johnny-come-lately with respect to St. Helena. And I have no doubt that there are many with us online today who have a far greater knowledge and a deeper understanding than I. Though I have been interested in the island for some years, and I visited 3 times: June last year, January this year, and June again this year. And who knows, I might go again. It's a place that lures one back. So to help you understand the geography of the island, I'll quickly show you, for those who don't know it, a couple of maps. And first of all, perhaps, just let me learn how to do this page down. How do I? I'm on keyboard. It's not working. Sorry, I'm just learning how to. Thank you. It did work. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. This shows the location of the island, which is right in the middle of well, not bang in the middle of the Atlantic, slightly closer to the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America, but it's very remote, as anyone who's tried to get to will discover, because it takes you about, you have to fly to South Africa and then back again to the island. But it's worth it when you get there. This just to show you 1 or 2 maps of the island. The first one, actually, on the title page, is the first earliest map from the late 15th century. A Portuguese visitor drew it, but it's incredibly inaccurate. You can see that it's symmetrical on all sides, so pretty difficult to navigate by. So this one, which is 1703 and is based on Seller's map from the previous century, which we'll look at a bit later, but it's getting a bit more accurate. And here's that's by John Thornton, and here's Thornton's map of the north coast, looking at Jamestown with a view of that, and which is where we'll be looking at 1 or 2 buildings shortly. The fort is obviously no longer there, although there is now a castle. And this is the island, a more accurate island map of the island from recent times, and is accurate. And the next one I just want to show you is because it gives you a clue about the nature of the island, which is basic that it is a large, it's the remains of a volcano, so all the rock is volcanic, and the coastal area remains extremely barren, with increasing vegetation as you go inland, and a cloud forest in the middle, which is actually currently being brought back to life very successfully. So it's a completely fascinating place. Um, and people will know probably most about what they, if you said St. Helena now, they'll say, ah, Napoleon. And of course, it is where he spent the last years of his 8 or so years of his life before he perished following his defeat at Waterloo. And I think he was brought to this island because it was rather more difficult to escape from than Elba had been. Um, and he lived in sort of rather sad end to his life in Longwood, which is here, which is uh, where he lived until he died in sort of um, pretended glory, really. With he had various generals who were in full fig, um, and but it was a sad end to his life, although he had caused fairly significant havoc to Europe during his life. And he was, after his death, he was buried here, and he remained below the Tolina earth until in 1840 he was gathered up by the French and brought back to Paris and buried in great pomp and ceremony, of course, underneath Les Invalides. The other survivor, living survivor from almost his time, born a little bit afterwards, whom you may also have heard of, is Jonathan, who I have had the pleasure to meet, who's about 180 years old or so. No one knows precisely, but about that. So that's a little bit about the things you may have heard about the island. And I just want to give a quick canter through the history of the island for those who have no idea of what its importance was. It was called Novas Castelo was a Portuguese captain returning from India, and he happened upon the island on the 21st of May in 1502. And this day was the anniversary of St. Helena, the mother of Constantine, and her name was therefore given to his discovery of what was then an uninhabited island. So we didn't wipe out a native population, unlike other islands that the British took over. But I can't resist telling you the extraordinary story of the first permanent resident, who was in fact one Fernando Lopez, a Portuguese deserter from Goa, who was arrested and for punishment with other deserters had his right hand and the thumb of his left hand lopped off. He jumped ship in St. Helena when being transported back to Portugal from Goa for probable execution, but escaped into the heavily wooded interior of the island. And not being found, at least initially, he remained for the rest of his life on that island for another 10 years or so, the only leaving to get to visit the Pope and receive absolution. So Portugal then continued to use the island as a staging point for ships returning from India, and did not make a permanent settlement there. The Dutch also used it for the same purposes, and there were inevitably skirmishes between them and the British East India Company, which resolved in 1658 to send 400 men to the island to fortify it and begin a plantation there. This took place and was the start of the East India Company's governorship of the island, which continued until the 1833 India Act, when control passed to the British colony, the British Crown as a British colony. And this status continued until 1981, when it became a British dependent territory, which it remains. Its citizens have the privilege of calling themselves saints. How nice it would be to achieve canonization without having to live a life worthy enough to deserve it otherwise, though they are, of course, lovely people. Until the 1860s, the island was very important for trade between the Indian continent and Europe, but this declined very rapidly in the second half of the 19th century, both because of the construction of the Suez Canal, which was completed in 1869, by which time also steamships were beginning to take over from sailing ships, and the need for revictualling, rest, and recreation was much diminished, and the island's economy was therefore severely affected. As another bit of background information, the population of the island, which reached its high point in 1901 at about 10,000, is now only a little over 4,000. But the buildings and the landscape of the island remain an important testament to the island's fascinating history and deserve protection and conservation notwithstanding its economic circumstances. In Jamestown alone, excluding the wharf, there are 18 Grade 2 listed buildings, 51 Grade 3, 2 and 61 Grade 3. Across the island, there are many more. These have been scheduled by a splendid man called Hugh Crellin, who in 1974, in just 6 weeks, was able to produce a brief description of the majority of the significant buildings, not only in Jamestown, but on the entire island, some of which, sad to say, have disappeared. So, to the business of the day. The talk which you thought you were coming to was called "The Abandoned Buildings of St. Helena," but actually, my wife Kitty thought that a better title would be "Buildings on the Brink," because abandoned buildings sounds so despairing, and I think there is hope for some of these buildings, and I will talk about some that have indeed been rescued. And we will come to this in a moment. As Desola outlined, I'm going to talk about buildings in Jamestown, the capital, wonderful surviving Georgian town, buildings in the country, which were largely the houses where the higher echelons of the East India Company would live in great splendor. And then finally, a group of some of the military buildings that survive to this day. So kicking off, this is a sort of an abandoned lime kiln, and I'm showing that really because there's lime was in very scarce supply on the island. There was a small amount, but most of the lime that was used for building was imported, and for that reason, the buildings were largely bedded in more or less mud mortar, and then only pointed up in lime because of its rarity. And starting there for Jamestown, I want to start with because it's a sort of a sad tale, really, with a building that was abandoned because of damage by fire in the 19th century. Porteous House, which was the grandest house in town. It's nearest to the castle, and a very fine building. But sadly, in 1865, was destroyed by fire. Sorry, for some reason on my screen I can only see half my slides, so I shall have to imagine it a little bit. But this shows is in 1865 the fire happened, and thereafter this is a photograph of the building as it survived into the 20th century as a masonry standing structure, but gutted inside. So it was at that stage abandoned. It was then destroyed, demolished in the 1980s, and was a developer got consent to build a replacement. Interior is going up, and he proudly said he was going to reproduce the external appearance of the original building. And this, as you will see here, he signally failed to do. I mean, you don't need to have a great knowledge of Georgian architecture to see that the proportions are completely, the windows are too small, the spacing is wrong, the coins on the corners don't go down to the ground. He's brought the raised ground floor down to ground level, so it no longer has the stature or grandeur of the previous building. So that was one sort of sad story. Here's another building that is not only abandoned but demolished, which is the old Exiles Club, which I rather like the look of, but that is gone forever. And I want to come now to one that is of current great concern, which is so-called Darling's House at number 5 Napoleon Street. Um, and that's sort of one of the upper streets of town, but still with some fine houses. And as you will see, this is a fine 5-bay Georgian building. And inside, that's the location of it in Napoleon Street. You can see my cursor is there. Um, and it's got a rear yard, and more of that in a moment. And then inside, this is the front hall and the basement lower ground area, which would have been used for service rooms and probably for accommodation for enslaved people in conjunction with the rear yard. Um, and this is the rear of the property with taken last June when the director of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum came to the island. And also there are Helena Bennett and Shelley Magellan Wade, both from the National Trust. And in the centre, was stooping down, I'm not quite sure why he's stooping down, might be in pain, is Brent Fortenbury, who is a professor of architectural history of the Atlantic world, who I've worked with both in Jamaica and in St. Helena. But I mentioned the rear yard, and these you see how many standing buildings are still standing here, and they are of great interest because they were where the kitchens were, and probably more accommodation for the enslaved. And a lot of the rear yards in town have been lost and developed with or without consent. So this is a rarer and rarer survival. And there's an application at the moment to demolish all the rear yard and to build a 3-story modern structure at the back of the garden. And there's considerable resistance to that. And there's another image of the rear yard, much overgrown, as you can see, and that's looking down on it again. So to get an idea of, it's sort of on the edge of the town, where if you were standing in this position, behind you is the sort of steep slope of the valley rising up, and that is an opportunity just to talk about the challenges for the historic environment on the island. One is that it's a struggling economy. It's currently a decline. There is a declining population. There's just one application for any planning consent, whether it's a listed building or not, and that means a rather undemanding requirement for listed buildings applications. There is no full or part-time conservation officer. So comments on the historic building aspects of any application tend to come in from the National Trust or the St. Helena Heritage Society, but those comments are advisory only and don't have any statutory, I don't believe, any statutory status. And the other issue is that in the UK, you would require a heritage impact statement. There's no one on island who can provide that. So, for instance, on that house in Napoleon Street, the applicant was going to bring someone over from the UK, but decided that was too expensive to do. So there are, I don't know how one sorts out these issues, but there are difficulties which mean that the protection of the buildings on the island is not as great as it would be in the UK. In addition, when it comes to actually carrying out building work, there are people with great skills on the island, but not enough of them. And the people implementing the conservation, the building work to a historic building are not really aware of the needs or have an understanding of how you should deal with a listed building. And of course, materials brought to the island for use of conservation repairs are more expensive than other materials. So there are all sorts of things arguing against the proper maintenance of the historic building. And one of the things that we're looking at and going to be encouraging in the conservation management plan that I and Brent and colleagues on the island are preparing is to think of ways in which grants could be given for the conservation of historic buildings. And it is important that we address all these things to maintain and protect the historic fabric of the island, which, in conjunction with the natural environment, is critical to its continuing attraction of the island for tourism. A couple of other quick things from Jamestown. This is the Run, which is a stream that runs down the centre of the valley. It was an open sewer, but happily that's now goes elsewhere. And it's now actually a very attractive walk, and we're very keen that that should be turned back into a much more used way from the upper town into the centre of town. And on the side of the Run, as it comes quite near town, is the Duke of Edinburgh's playground, which has been no longer acting as a playground and is now, in fact, an abandoned space. And it was formerly a burial ground with these splendid St. Helenian gum trees, which were probably those that were planted by, sorry, why it's gone up, planted by Governor, and I can't see because I can't read my own comment, but in the early 18th century. And one thing we're going to propose is part of it might be turned into a small children's playground, and the rest of it is a park. And because it's on a burial ground, would be a sort of garden of remembrance as well. So that I think is we're leaving Jamestown now and heading into the country. And just as en passant, this is just a frivolity really, because this is long gone, this windmill, which is somewhere near Longwood. And one thing that's interesting about that is that it's got no wind vane. In other words, it's always facing in the same direction. And that's because the prevailing wind always comes from the same direction. So there's no point in having something that's swiveled round. And this is today's version. And just it's really an aside. And this, with the fairly regular sunshine that the island gets, should mean that the island can be completely self-sufficient in terms of energy any moment now, and getting rid of any fossil fuel generated power. So turning to one or two houses that were abandoned. This was probably mid-20th century, a house called Teutonic Hall, and there it is in sometime after that, later on, and this most recently before it was taken over in 2017, and it was bought by Henry Thorpe and his family, and he's taken a keen interest in the historic houses of the island, and has rescued several. And I think it's a continuing interest, if not passion, of his, and one has to be very grateful to him for that, because out of that he has now brought this back to what it looked like in the mid-20th century and before. He's turned it into 3 flats, but the building stands in its landscape as it always used to. And another one was Rock Rose. This says 1980s, but I think it possibly was, but it certainly can't be the same 1980s as this one, which shows a very much more derelict building. This house was called Rock Rose, and sits in a splendid position in the country. And again, Henry has managed to turn it back into this. And all praise to him for doing so. Another house, Wrangham's, was bought by Neil and Debbie Phantom. He's now the chairman of the St. Helena National Trust, and he has carefully restored that and added a little extension on the back as well, which a modern thing, but it's a sort of, I think, works well as a contrast to the original building. And the original building is restored very carefully. And incidentally makes terrific coffee. There's one other person who's a savior of buildings, called Brian Davis, who is an absolutely fascinating man who is hugely interested both in the knowledgeable in the timbers, island timbers that can be used in construction rather than importing timber, and also in analyzing the mortars that were originally used and using them again himself. And he makes all his own joinery. So this was White's cottage, and here is White's cottage, not quite complete, but nearing completion, with him standing in front of it. And it's an exemplary piece of work. He retains as much of the masonry as he possibly can, and as I say, makes all his own joinery. And here is another one that he's also restored, which is Wee Bothy, and that's as it was when he found it, and this as it is now. So abandoned buildings being rescued. And the next one is, I want to quickly show you again, which has been to some extent rescued, is Toby's cottage, which was you checking on the time? Okay, good. Sorry, that aside. It was Toby was an enslaved person under uh, William Balcomb's ownership, and who owned a property called the Briars. And Napoleon was there for a few months when he was on island in 1815, between 18th of October and the 10th of December, before he moved. And during that time, Napoleon struck up a sort of friendship, and indeed on several occasions tried to buy Toby's freedom. And that his relationship with Toby is why we know anything about him. But he lived in this tiny cottage, and this is it before any work was done on it. And you can see quite a few standing walls still. And this is plans for how it was going to be restored, showing again the walls that were missing and those have been those were still standing. And this is the Toby's cottage rebuilt, but I'm afraid not taking Brian Davis's attitude of saving whatever he possibly could of the original fabric, and building on it, but demolishing the whole thing and starting all over again. And for those who share the same interests about conservation, you'll note that the mortar used there is very definitely a cement mortar and no sign of mud or lime in it. So not following what we would call the SPAB principles, Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. So one more building which is of interest, which is to us, is the so-called #1 building for liberated Africans. And this stands in Rupert's Bay, which is the next bay round from Jamestown, and had become vacant and unused, and is going to be used as a museum, memorializing telling the story of the liberation of Africans after we, the British, stopped the slave trade ourselves. We then began policing the seas, sort of, as it were, joining the good guys up to a point, and liberating enslaved people from mainly Portuguese slave ships, and bringing them to St. Helena as a halfway house. Sadly, because of the condition many of them were in, quite a few died, but many others were then onward transported to the Caribbean. Not many are back to Africa and elsewhere, and it's about 20 or 30,000 between the sort of 1840s and 1850s were brought to the island, and it's a story that's little known, and so I think it's going to be a really worthwhile museum, as well as it's going to have a garden of memory, because some of the remains that were dug up when the airport was built have been reburied there. So it will be a place of memory, and also, as I say, a place where that story, which is I knew nothing about and which is little known, can be told. And that is the #1 building as it is today, and the inside, which is where at the moment awaiting a price for the basic restoration of this building, and then we'll hopefully will proceed. So turning to military structures, because they are truly abandoned, because they certainly have no potential military use. I think the chances even of the President of the United States thinking that'd be an interesting little place to take over is unlikely. So, but it was very heavily fortified for many years. I mean, obviously, when the East India Company had it, they were protecting themselves against uh, all sorts of other people who might have been interested to take over the island, including the Dutch and the Portuguese. Then it was reinforced when Napoleon was here, in case the French had ideas. And it did again. The military, the guns and things were changed and updated for the First World War, although I don't think they saw much action. So there are lots of interesting structures. This is Ladder Hill Fort, which sits at the top of Ladder Hill above Jamestown, and that building behind you is currently vacant. There is Brent Fortenberry taking a photograph of a window, and the um, uh, the potential for it is it was considered as a hotel at one time, and that actually wouldn't be a bad use if it's possible to increase the level of tourism. You have wonderful views and a long flight of 600 steps to get down into Jamestown. But I've suggested one might have a funicular, which would be rather fun. And then I say a riddle, because what are these little circular in place places along the front wall? And I said, all I can think is it might have been for a sort of some kind of gun of some sort. Anyway, ideas welcome. And turning to High Knoll Fort, which is again quite close to Jamestown. This drawing by can't remember by whom or if we even know, but of 1784, shows circled High Knoll Fort, and then Jamestown you can see below with its at the bottom of that steep valley. And that's an aerial view of High Knoll Fort, and a rather more charming and fanciful view um, of how it looked or imagined to have looked. And it looks even more precipitous sides than they actually are, but it just still is in a very significant building and location. And it was occupied by the 20th Regiment during the Napoleonic period. After Napoleon's death, forces withdrew from the fort, but it was further developed in the 1860s. So northern portions of the fort date from the 1790s, and southern portion dates from the 1860s. And the final phase of construction was completed later in the 19th century. And it is it's an extraordinary place and building, and because of its proximity to Jamestown, is certainly something which could be developed for tourism. However, and here's just a few more images of it, taken by Brent, who did a wonderful sort of drone surveys of many of the military buildings on the island. But it has its problems, and here you can see a bit of the curtain wall having fallen down. And one question is what do we do about that? I think that it's fairly certain that trying to rebuild would be a huge operation, but we may have to limit ourselves to consolidating and preventing further collapse. And this again, more images of the current situation. Then Banks Battery, which is further along the coast, circled in red on this map, which is indeed the map of John Seller, which I referred to earlier. And it is very inaccessible. So both from the tourism point of view, except by sea, and also in terms of repairs and maintenance, it's quite a tricky prospect. But it is a fascinating series of buildings. I don't think you can read quickly what is here, but I won't read it out again myself. But the fortification basically fell into disrepair by the middle of the 19th century. And much is still standing, but it does need, there is collapse happening, and it would be nice, if nothing else, to try and halt that and maintain what the structures, as much of the structure as we can. There's another example of collapsing wall on the lower banks batteries, lower banks and upper banks batteries. And so, whoops, sorry. Finally, really, in terms of the military structures, there's Munden's battery, which sits, again, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, it sits, there's Jamestown in this valley, and it sits on this little promontory here, so it's got a wonderful location. And seen from the sea, here it is with these little white buildings here and various other fortifications at that upper level. And the last use there was of that white building was, curiously enough, when Bahrain was a British protectorate. There were three rebellious, I think they were princes, but they were anyway Bahrainis, who, when Britain thought they were being troublesome, and they resettled them for a short, very short period, right? I think about 1957 to 60 or something like that. They lived there and then secured their freedom. But it's quite a sort of strange episode, really, in the history of the island. There has been place of where Napoleon was put, and then these Bahrainis. But they were not there for so long and avoided death on the island. But it's got a wonderful location, and here it is. Here's the white building, poised on the edge of that cliff, and looking down on one side onto Jamestown, and on the other side out to sea. It has its challenges, but offers are being asked for at the moment to turn it into something and make use of the buildings. It'll be a challenge, certainly, because as you can see from the photograph on the right, that the white building is actually rather precarious. But certainly ideas are being had by one or two people about what might happen to it. It'll be rather interesting to see how that one works out. So turning finally really to other buildings on the brink, which are still teetering on the brink, are some more houses in the country, and there probably, I mean, many more than I'm shown are available. So if you're interested, let me know, and I can put you in touch with whoever. And some more again. It's a fascinating island, and that really brings me to the end, except for one last slide, which is this. And it's a sort of slightly jokey slide from the wonderful website about St. Helena called St. Helena Island Info. And I'm indebted to John to this site for lots of images that are contained within this talk. And anyone who wants to know anything about aspects of St. Helena could do much worse than visit that site. And I'm also indebted to my colleague and friend, Brent Fortenbury, for all his images and advice, and also to Henry Thorpe and Brian Davis for allowing me to share images of their work and to share their enthusiasms and knowledge of the island. So thanks to them. Thank you, all of you, for withstanding this long spiel. And I'm very happy to take any questions you may have. Or if you're sated, I will also quite understand. Thank you.
Sorry, just before we go to questions, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Peregrine. This is all very interesting. Actually, I'll see if there are any questions first. Whilst we wait for that, I have a question.
Yes.
A lot of the projects that you've sort of shown that have been rescued seem to be mostly individual efforts. And I'm wondering, is that sort of the main way most of these buildings are saved? Are they through sort of individual people who have the fortitude to take one on?
I think it's exactly that. It's relying on the enthusiasm and of individuals and either the money to do it, or the sort of sheer dedication. I mean, which I think I would say Brian Davis has in spades. He's just, it's his passion, and it's a completely fascinating man. And uh, yeah, and I admire what he does. But I mean, we do. I don't know what other answers there are. I mean, the National Trust, they've got no, St. Helena National Trust don't have the money to own and restore buildings. Um, I think if it would be interesting for us, for the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, to help on the training, because one of the things that we're obviously very interested in doing is training up young people in traditional building skills. And we're certainly looking to do that on the island, and looking for a project that we could work on that would involve training. I mean, that's one avenue that we are actively pursuing as a body, as an organization.
Okay. Well, we have got a question from Peter John Francis. It says, thank you, Peregrine. How challenging is the climate to preservation efforts?
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I would say actually it's pretty kind in the sense that I mean, there's wind and there's rain, but it's a pretty it gets quite warm in the summer, but not impossibly, at least at the moment, not impossibly warm. Obviously there are no real winters. I mean, I quite like being on the island in winter because it's sort of comfortable weather to work in. It never freezes. So I mean, I think that the main hazards are probably the fact that if the pointing mortar on a masonry wall disappears, then the wind and the rain can destroy the sort of mud mortar more readily than it could um, to a sort of a limier mortar mix, if that
So
makes
there's
sense.
sort of no humidity issues there. I would
Um,
have thought with the clouds
no,
following and it's not so clear.
I don't think so.
Oh,
No, um, I think buildings sometimes get demolished by other, once they get to a ruinous state, they're robbed for their stone. Um, but even that's not very much. So they tend to just, I think one of the problems is that because of the level of population on the island, um, there's going to, at the moment, if you think that the population was once 10,000 and is now 4, that means there's less demand for built structures.
yeah. I mean, with a dwindling population, is there sort of a foreseeable population? Because it sort of seems like it's not the easiest place to live. Um, and maybe,
It's very. I think that's untrue. It's a very easy and lovely place to live. It's the only problem is that if you want to go and visit your friends or children elsewhere, it takes you so long to get to and from.
oh,
Um, but it's. I mean, I wouldn't mind living here at all. Living there, I'm getting into sleep. I'm imagining I'm on the island suddenly. But yeah, I mean, there are, and I think there's been an influx is perhaps not the right word, but quite a few Zimbabweans coming to the island recently, interestingly.
so is
Um,
there sort of enough people for the skills that they need to be trained on the island?
I would say yes. I mean, I think, but one of the problems of the island in terms of its economy is the um, lack of companies, of things, of people, of demands for labor. Um, there are very few businesses um, set up. There was an idea at one time of starting a call center on island, which seemed to be rather a good idea, but then COVID happened and it hasn't been revived. So we shall
Yeah,
see. We
yeah,
shall see. Yeah.
thank you. I can't see any other question. Actually, I think there is a question here from Morag Cross. Would crowdfunding not be possible for things like the Liberated Africans Museum? I
Well,
guess that.
I think it might be. I think on that one, in fact, I think that's something we're hopeful that we will get a grant or two. Because I think it's a sort of thing that will, and I think crowdfunding is a good idea. Yes, and I think that Catherine Pryor, who is I think amongst those listening this evening, is a fundraiser for the St. Helena government, and I'm sure she's considering every option, including that one. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Um, who is we for the Liberated African Museum? Like, who are the people working on it?
Ah, well, yeah, it's a trust a project being driven by the National Trust, St. Helena National Trust, and they are the sort of managing the whole process, but they haven't got any money to do it. They need money to be from elsewhere, and the immediate thing is to get the fabric of the building, and the internal arrangements and the roof done, and then the museum will be sort of the follow-on from that, and then probably, and with the hope is there'll be another little building across a garden of remembrance, which will contain a cafe and sort of meeting room and things like that. So it's overall it's quite a big project, but the initial thing is to get the building sound and restored.
Catherine has confirmed she's indeed considering all funding options. So if anyone would like to
I thought
support
she
the
would be.
project.
Exactly. Yes, yes. Good.
Okay, I don't think there are any other questions or comments. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Ha. Um, I was afraid I was going to take too long, and I probably took not long enough. But I think I covered most of what I wanted to say. Um, and as I say, I think it's a. I hate just calling things abandoned buildings because that does make one feel slightly despairing. Um, and one ought always to live in hope, which I do. Um, and I do hope to be. I mean, I have an ambition to bring someone that you know as well as I, practically, which is Clive Dawson,
Ah,
um,
yes.
consulting structural engineer, of great fame and experience. And I think his advice will be very valuable if we can lure him out there to look at both the forts and also one or two other buildings that have potential structural problems. Yeah.
Well, fingers crossed you'll be able to sort of raise enough whilst it still stands. I mean, it's always a bit difficult with buildings at risk. But
Yeah.
well, thank you very much for the questions, and thank you, Peregrine, for a wonderful talk. I did not know anything about St. Helena's, to be honest, before this, and there's definitely a lot more on the island than one would have thought, and I think Morag feels the same.
Well, feel free to come. But one thing actually, which will, because the tourism numbers, because that is absolutely in a way critical to the economy, is to build the tourism numbers. And when the airport was built, the idea was that they would initially, I think the business plan was 60,000 visitors. Well, dream on, and then it was reduced to 30,000. Last year, I think they had a little over 5,000, and it is gradually increasing. But if you tell people, which I regularly do, that they ought to visit, and how do I get there? And you say, well, you fly to Johannesburg or Cape Town, and then you sleep overnight, and then you get on a plane, 5-hour flight next day, and with luck you'll be able to land, provided the wind isn't in the wrong direction, and preventing you from landing, as occasionally happens. First time we went, we were delayed 2 days. Um, And somehow there has to be a way around that because it is a disadvantage, it is incentive to coming to the island if you realize that. Anyway, but I don't want to put anyone off. Everyone
Well,
must
it's
visit.
on the list of, I think, the top 10 least visited places in the world. So it'll be off the beaten track. So you can sort of
Yes.
have your own experience that is slightly different from everyone else's. And
Yeah.
there's more information and details on the liberated African establishment on the UK St. Helena Heritage Trust website.
Yeah.
I think
Indeed.
Catherine's put that in the chat box if anyone wants to look that up.
Oh, well done, Catherine. Thank you. Yes. Good,
Very
good.
good. All right. Well, a huge thank you to Peregrine and thank you to everyone. I hope you can join us for the last talk in the series, which is next week, Wednesday at 6 p.m. with Saba, and it's going to be on Pakistan. So thank you again, everyone. And I wish you, I was going to say evening, but I'm conscious everyone is in different time zones. So rest of the day.
Thank you, Desola.
Thank you.